dynamics between social media and education. And I've been asked today to talk specifically about social media. I guess I'll use the term association with evidence rather than the evidence base behind social media. So just to get some of the disclosures out of the way, I am a millennial, I am entitled, don't hold it against me, and by association I am a digital native, albeit a late one because I got my first computer after high school. So the theme of this conference has always been about sort of the old and new of medical education. So we'll talk about the old and new of the evidence behind social media. We'll talk about what's been happening in the last couple of years in the peer review realm and try and contextualise this against what has been done in the past with the older technologies. And I know David Bartlett yesterday talked a lot about the future of technology, communication and education. And so we'll only briefly talk about the trajectory that evidence-based medicine is sending us in terms of social media. So when I open my mouth and start talking about social media, I usually get two responses. And I know that there were a few shenanigans going on last night at the dinner, and I'm glad to see that the first response that I normally get looking around the room isn't really evidence today. So I'm glad that that's the case. But more importantly, I think, is the second response that I get. And I'm quite excited when people ask me, well, what is social media? And I guarantee you, if you look at dictionaries, Wikipedia, blogs, or ask it on Twitter, you'll get 100 different responses, even with these peer-reviewed articles where they define what social media is in order to launch their results and interpret them and discuss them. You'll find that actually there is no unifying definition of what social media is. It's all descriptive in terms of, well, it's this thing that's in the cloud, that's in the air, that's on your phone, that helps communicate things together. You know, it's the vibe. And that poses a problem when we're talking about evidence-based medicine because you can't really take the vibe and try and test it. So I'm going to approach this mentality with if you can't beat them, join them, and tell you what I think social media is, so that at least we're on the same playing field when we talk about the evidence. So in the beginning, when the universe was formed, there was no internet. And I can see that some of you find this surprising. In 1990, the World Wide Web was formed. So this was Web 1.0, static pages with hyperlinks where you could click to another static page, so on and so forth. And then in 1999, it evolved into this sort of Web 2.0 is what we're calling it now, which is, I guess, the main differentiating factor being that it is interactive. And to me, this is what social media is. It's interactivity in an online environment, be it posting a video to YouTube or posting a podcast online, or even just commenting on something online. That's all sort of interacting with that web page. And that's what I think social media is. And so fundamentally, that involves sharing. And that's what we've been talking about over the last couple of days with regards to making communities online through technology. But the other fundamentally important part of social media or Web 2.0 is the content. Because if you've got no content, if you don't even have 140 characters, how are you going to share that? And so I'm going to call this trans social media spectrum and see if it takes off. But essentially, down the one end of the spectrum, you've got YouTube and blogs and things like that, where fundamentally it's about creating and putting it online for people to see. Whereas at the other end of the spectrum, you've got sharing like Twitter, where you're providing 140 characters, but essentially what you're trying to do is share that information. So if we plot all the big players in social media along this social media spectrum, we find a chart like this, where down the one end you've got things that are resource heavy when you're creating, and we've had a couple of breakout sessions showing us how to create videos at a budget price. But at the other end, where it's really easy to create, but you can't create very much because you're mostly about sharing. And you can see that podcasts here as well. They're sort of drifting along the Web 1.0 and Web 2.0 fence, because if you're downloading a podcast and listening to it, there is no interaction. You can't really call it social media, but some people do. The other thing about this graph is that you also see that there really is a divide. Now, there are things that balance creation and sharing together. But really, if you draw a line in the sand where sharing becomes more fundamental than creation, then you've got what we now know, or what people are calling social networking sites. And I think that's what people are referring to when they're calling it social media, is social networking sites. And this is important because when you're trying to compare, say, a sharing modality versus a video modality, it's apples and oranges. You can't really compare the two. But that's what people have been trying to do, as we'll see later on. So I can see there's a couple of big players out there, like Anthony Luen from the Twitter universe, and a couple of other big names in terms of social media and medical education. But for those of you who aren't quite aware, I'll give a brief synopsis of social media and medical education. So I guess in the beginning there was a few who embraced social media and medical education and thought, this is amazing. And what they did was they got a few more followers, so they were the first followers, and somehow this became somewhat evangelistic. And whenever something becomes evangelistic, you find that the devil's advocates come out of the waterworks. And that was the first issue with social media and it's being tarnished, was that there was no evidence base. You were creating overnight experts, and therefore you couldn't trust this information. And that was an issue. But an even bigger issue came along, and which is fundamental to the movement of social media in medical education and in medicine in particular, is that of professionalism. The issue here was that no longer could you just ignore it. No longer could institutions and organisations ignore social media. They had to look at it, they had to assess it, and they had to come up with policy for it. And through this process, as doctors, it sort of normalised social media and medicine in general, and sort of gave the nod that actually we can use it in medicine, whether or not that was the intention or not. And so what happened, and as you guys have been seeing on the conference circuit in education over the last couple of years, we've got workshops and keynotes about how to utilise and why social media is so good in medical education. And through this, we've come back to the start. Social media is awesome. But standing here today, what we're talking about is whether or not it truly is, and sort of assessing the evidence behind it. So, like a typical millennial, I took a shortcut and tried to find a review that summarised all the evidence so that I didn't have to do anything. And I found this. So it was by Cheston. It's a review back in 2013, and what they looked at was everything that mentioned social media from the beginning of time up into 2011. And of the 900 searches that came back, only 10 of them really fit in with a social media intervention and a description of the result. And what they found were twofold. The first was that most of these social media, and I use the term social media, were blogs, not Twitter, not Facebook, not social networking sites. They were blogs. And the second was that they were all undergraduate papers regarding undergraduate people. And what they found, and this is fair enough because social media was just being born around that time in terms of medical education, was that we just, there's no evidence out there, there's a lack of evidence out there, we need more evidence, but the overwhelming thing that they did find through the descriptions was that the learners seemed to like it. So moving forward, this was published this year, and you can see that they've now refined their terminology, and they're using that term, social networking sites, and they're also applying it to the undergraduate cohort in this circumstance anyway. So between 2004 and 2014, they had a look at all the papers, and again they got around 10,000 back, but only 14 of them really tested an intervention and looked at the outcome. And again, what they found was that there is a lack of evidence, that there needs to be more evidence, but unanimously, the learners seem to like it. An example of one of these descriptive papers, which was also published this year by the guys over at Johns Hopkins, but with a resident cohort, was this paper. And what they did is they enrolled all their first year residents and set up a Twitter handle and tweeted out all the references for their, as an adjunct to their learning curriculum as well as some key points by some Twitter folk there as well. And they did a pre and post test survey and had a look to see what the reactions were. Before the test, they found that 85% of the residents thought that, hey, social media probably does have a role in medical education. And then after the intervention, they found that 95% thought that social media had a role in medical education. So again, they found that there is a lack of evidence, there needs to be more evidence, but learners seem to like it. Perhaps the only real study that showed an intervention with a learning outcome was this one, which was published last year by the guys over at Kentucky. And they used an interesting method in that they enrolled their second-year medical students who were enrolled in the Introduction to Clinical Medicine, and being at university, it was sort of mandatory that you had to participate in this. And what they did was, as an adjunct to their lecture series, which showed clinical photos each week, they had a Twitter quiz each week as well, which showed photos that were not in the lecture and asked the students to participate. And what they did to sweeten the deal was they said, hey, if you're in one of the first 20 to get this Twitter quiz right for this week, we'll give you a bonus mark at the end of the year for your summative exam score. And so what did they find? So after that, what they did was they had their summative exam, which only included, and the students knew this, only included the lecture photos, nothing to do with Twitter. But they also got everyone to do a formative exam that was anonymous with regards to 50% photos from the lecture and 50% photos from the Twitter quizzes. And what they found was that for those who did the Twitter questions every week, they got 50% of the lecture photos right, and that was the same as the guys that didn't use Twitter at all. But more interestingly, the ones that used Twitter each week, they only were able to recall 30% of the Twitter photos. So they came to the conclusion here that actually Twitter doesn't help with recall all that well at all. And I can see you all going, but the fundamental issue is that Viet has said that this social media spectrum doesn't match. We're talking about a sharing modality and a creativity modality in terms of lectures, so to speak, even though it's not social media. They're completely different learning theories. And I won't use the term learning styles because I think Terry's already debunked that one. But again, there is some evidence, there needs to be more evidence. Learners seem to like it though. So if we use Kirkpatrick's 4 criteria for testing the efficacy of a learning intervention or an education intervention, we see that from a reaction point of view, learners seem to like it. That seems to be unanimous. But do 2 likes make a right? And unfortunately, in this case, that's probably not the whole picture. With regards to learning or learning outcomes like exams, we see that really they're not really testing it, and so we don't have any information on that. And I guess with regards to clinician outcomes and patient outcomes, I'm not going to go there because I think in medical education we're already struggling in general to be able to assess those 2 criteria. So we've had a look at some of the new stuff and the current stuff that's out there. Let's take a look now at some of the older evidence where we've got a lot of information for to see if the technology that's changed has affected the learning outcomes or not. And what better way to do that than with PowerPoint? So even though it says copyright 1987, Microsoft bought PowerPoint and rebranded it in 1990, and that's really when it was released to the public. But really, the first semblance of a peer review article on PowerPoint was in 1998, so 8 years after the fact. This review article assessed 8 years worth of articles on PowerPoint, and what they found was, hey, students seem to like it, a common theme. But unlike social media, what they found was, instead of there being a lack of evidence, there was in fact evidence to suggest that there was no difference between traditional education media and PowerPoint, and yet we're so invested in the technology today, and that's something to think about. I'll bring you back to this paper, which was published around the time I was born. Because really, what's old is new again, and that's part of the theme of this conference as well. And what we found is that, and this is important, that the media that we're using, the technology that we're using is important, but what's even more important is the content that we're given, that we're giving the learners. Because really, you don't want to be the dump truck driver of a brand new garbage truck delivering garbage to learners. That's what it is. And equally, learners don't want to receive any garbage. And this is reiterated by Rowland and Brazel in 2015, I think this one was published, where they tried to reconcile traditional media and social media. And they reiterated the fact that these medias are all mediums. You need the good content there to start off with, because if you don't have good content, then your message is just going to be lost. And I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about, now that I've talked about social media and the evidence behind it, not to talk about the social media evidence-based medicine. Now, we all know about the impact factors of peer-reviewed journals. And for those that don't, what they do is they calculate how many citations a journal has over a 2-year period and divide it by the number of articles that they've published, and they come up with an impact factor. And the idea is that the bigger your impact factor is, the more prestigious your journal is. And obviously there's a few fundamental flaws with that idea, but that's what we're working with at this stage. What's come into light, though, is companies like Altmetric, where they're scouring the internet for comments on the articles or mentions of the articles from blogs to social media and so on and so forth. Altmetrics just seems to be the one that all the journal companies are buying at the moment. And where this is going is unclear, but the fact that a lot of the journal articles are paying big bucks to have these altmetrics on their websites linked to their articles tells us something about the future. So speaking about the future, we've talked about Web 1.0, we've talked about Web 2.0 as the interactivity, and those that know how to count to 3 will know that Web 3.0 is coming. But the question is, what is Web 3.0? And no one really understands what it is yet, but it will have implications on education and medical education. Some people think that it's artificial intelligence. You know, when you sort of want to Google something and it already pops up with what you want to Google before you even realise you wanted to Google it? That sort of stuff is what some people think Web 3.0 is. And that'll have implications on education in ways that we don't understand at the moment. But others think that it's artificial intelligence, and others more think that it's probably something to do with mobility. But we're not really sure if we're there yet, what it is. But again, it'll shift the focus from social media to something else later on. This is a graph of unique Australian visitors per month to the big social media websites that have to do with education. There's a lot of lines in there, but what I want you to focus on is the top two, Facebook and YouTube. They seem to be on an upwards trajectory since 2011. If we take away all the lines to make it a bit simpler to read, we can see this little program called WhatsApp, which is really just text messaging online with group interaction. We can see that, you know, it's from 2014, it's sort of made its way up there and slowly creeping up. What's more important, though, is this. We're using Twitter so much in social media at the moment, and yet a company startup in 2014 has now overtaken Twitter in terms of number of users. And how this translates into how medical education takes up new technology has to be questioned as well. The other two things I want to talk about is this. Blogspot is now called Blogger, and MySpace were the two biggest giants in sort of social media, social networking sites in the early days. And they're, even though it looks like they're still alive, they're really dying a slow and painful death. And then the other one I want to bring your attention to is WordPress, which is the main blogging site for medical education as well as everything else. It seems to have, you know, in 2013 had a spike and then sort of plateaued. And I guess the more revealing thing is, from a Twitter point of view, is that it's really plateaued as well. And although these statistics themselves tell a story, I guess the bigger picture is that these statistics are dependent on a whole lot of factors, including world finance and markets. Because what we see here, and this was just published a week ago, and if you guys follow the Twitter news, is that earlier this year, the Twitter board wanted to sell itself off. It offered it to Google, who had some interest, offered it to Apple, who also had some interest. Neither of them wanted to take it, and so their stocks plummeted, and they're sort of on a downward trend in terms of how much money they're generating, and then whether or not they're going to turn into Blogger and MySpace as well. And that has implications on how we use the technology now, because if those who are using Twitter, how are they going to translate Twitter if it dies to WhatsApp or whatever other medium comes up in 2 or 3 years' time? And I think that's the clear message that social media and evidence is telling us now, is that not that we have to embrace it, not that it's new and that it's useful for learning outcomes, but inherently that we need to show adaptability. Because if you have a look from the prehistoric ages when we were writing in dirt, to painting on walls, to chiseling out on slates, to writing on paper, to looking at overhead transparencies, to PowerPoint, to social media today, that life cycle of new technology is getting faster and faster and faster. And we can't adapt to that, then our learners are going to suffer and our patients are going to suffer. So this paper was published, I think, in 1968. That's the oldest paper I've got, way before I was born. And the same rules still apply. We need to be more adaptable to changing technology. So I guess to summarise in the only millennial way that I know how, don't deliver garbage. Make sure that your content is robust, because if you've got good content, no matter what the technology, you can move that content onto that technology. And invest in adaptability, because the tech will follow the learner in this circumstance rather than the other way around, where at the moment the learner is following the technology. We're chasing after Twitter and we're chasing after Facebook, trying to make it work for us. But if we adapt, then the technology will follow us. Thanks. Sorry. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Viet, for that very challenging talk. We do have time for questions, and so I'd like to ask you, if you have questions, to move to the microphones on either side and just introduce yourselves. And so we've got, should be able to take quite a few questions. Yes.
Hi, I'm Malik. I'm a PGY2 and a definite millennial. Just got a sort of a two-part question to you. One, with the sort of explosion of these web-based content delivery systems, diverging from textbooks and lectures and things like that, should we in medicine have a position on the reliable access of broadband internet for people around the country so that we can actually access these online resources, lectures, audiobooks, things like that? And two, you gave the example of the Twitter quiz adding summative marks to the end of an assessment. How do you deal with the implication of people not necessarily agreeing with, say, the privacy policy of various social media sort of apps and how they use information, and those that decline to accept those terms and conditions being disadvantaged in their medical training?
Okay, so I guess for the first question, you really talk about the NBN there, are you, and how it doesn't work?
I'll leave that open.
So yeah, I agree, and I think everyone else agrees that really none of this is going to work unless you've got that infrastructure from an online environment point of view and access to it. But I think we're moving into that sort of that realm where that's where the market is focused, and that's where the governments are focused. And when the government's focused on something, that it'll hopefully happen eventually, but at the very least it's important. So I think, yes, you're right in that we do need that infrastructure in order to support that social medium or that online medium.
But I mean, should we have a statement saying that we as medical professionals and educators demand access to that medium, or do we just leave it for the government to decide what we get?
I think as a player in the world of the internet, we probably do have a role, but it's a very small role. The issue being the fact that we can't link the use of technology for education with patient outcomes yet. And if you're looking at the pencil pushers, that's what they're looking at is, does this translate to better patient care? Does this translate to less morbidity and mortality? And until we can get that evidence, unfortunately, and we can see here that probably will never happen with PowerPoint and things like that, we probably don't have much in the way of leverage in sort of convincing them. But it's always good to try. Now, with your second question, can you just remind me what that was?
Sure. So, as in, if with people who are using, say, Twitter to gain summative marks in their assessment, what happens to the people who don't agree with, say, the privacy policy terms and conditions, how their information is used by Twitter or Facebook or WhatsApp, whatever, and therefore don't use those services and are therefore disadvantaged and assessment?
Yeah, and I agree. That was another, in their discussion, that was a fundamental flaw with regards to, I'm not going to use Twitter, A, because I don't know how to, B, because I don't have access to it, or C, because I don't appreciate the privacy policies, and therefore I'm not going to get those bonus marks and be disadvantaged. I guess I agree with you that that's probably not a fair way to do a study like that. But I guess what the authors would argue is the fact that these are bonus marks, and although you're not disadvantaged because all the questions are from the clinical lecture series, that you should be able to pass anyway. And it's unclear, I guess, from the methodology and the results, whether or not those bonus marks could get you from a fail to a pass, or just a pass to a better pass. And I guess that's also important from a participant point of view, and also those who don't wish to engage in Twitter.
Thanks, Viet. Anthony Llewellyn. James Edwards describes me as a Gen X with a Y chromosome. So thanks firstly for the plug for On the Wards. I wanted to ask you the question I was going to ask David Bartlett yesterday around this concept of co-construction and, moving from creating content to sharing and getting people engaged and producing the content for you. I wonder whether you think it's, particularly from a business perspective, is it about wanting to develop communities of practice or actually identifying the signal nodes in those communities of practice that people aggregate towards and treat as the referent experts? And with the rise of FOMED, I think that's kind of important because you can see certain sites being seen as the good ones to go to with questionability about whether that is or isn't a good approach. Do you think it's about nodes or co-construction? And as an add-on to that, do you think we should be teaching social media marketing at medical school now? Because it seems like, regardless of whether we're comfortable with it or not, it's going to be something that will be needed as a tool into the future for doctors.
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. With regards to the first point about communities and nodes, I do think that communities are good, and they propagate that whole social constructivism learning theory. But at the same time, the big issue with things like Twitter and social media is that, with regards to your learning outcomes, it's very difficult to gauge what you're actually trying to do on Twitter. I mean, the guys that invented Twitter, when they were first asked, "What is Twitter?" They all said, "We don't know. We just let them do what they want." And that's, they didn't invent the hashtag. They didn't invent the @handles. They just said, "Here is a platform. You guys do with it what you want." And that's sort of how it's evolved over time. The problem that they see themselves in now is the fact that they haven't asked, what have we done in the last 10 years with regards to that? But because of this sort of fundamental flaw of really not knowing what you do, if you do have a community, you also need leadership within that community. So I think it's going to be a balance of having nodes that know how to create communities and nodes that know how to foster those communities, as opposed to nodes that communities are going towards as a one-way process.
All right. Thanks very much, Viet. I'm Liz. I'm an HMO3 from Western in Victoria. I'm wondering if you have any anecdotal experience or anything in the research about patients and their opinion of doctors using social media for their education, especially if they can also follow it on Twitter or if they can have a look, and especially, I suppose, doctors or medical students using their phones, say in the ED where I'm working at the moment.
Yep. I don't have any real evidence, but I guess from reading, it seems that that it does seem unprofessional that if you're holding a phone that you don't have the knowledge, and even though it's okay to say, "I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that, but I'll find it out," it seems quite unprofessional in this culture of pulling your phone out and trying to find the result. Obviously, most patients will have no idea with regards to evidence-based practice and best practice from that point of view. So I don't know if that's such an issue that they're finding unreliable evidence. I guess on the other side of things, though, is that there is this thing that patients go to called Dr. Google, and trying to get patients to understand this whole concept of Dr. Google versus a doctor using Google, two completely separate things, is difficult for them to understand. And I don't know how, and I don't know when that understanding will come about.
Hi, Alistair from Hobart, definitely digital native. We all love evidence-based medicine. Viet, do you have any concerns about the rise of eminence-based medicine and social media being used as a tool to facilitate that?
I think eminence-based medicine is already in evidence-based medicine, and I think everyone could agree that just because you've got 100 citations on a controversial article and an impact factor of 2,000 doesn't necessarily mean that it's a good paper. But so eminence-based medicine is, throughout evidence-based medicine as we see it at the moment. For those that don't know about I did a paper on upper GI bleeding, catastrophic upper GI bleeding, and if you have a look at the big papers that come out of that, it's all they're eminent papers that lack evidence, but yet they're continually quoted time and time again as to best practice from that point of view. So in terms of social media, I think you're not really moving the goalposts that much. Yes, market penetration is going to be bigger. Yes, there are going to be more opinions. And yes, eminence is going to, unfortunately, overtake evidence. But in saying that, I think we all know that, again, evidence has its flaws as well.
Thanks for that. Very entertaining, great slides as well. Take your point about no matter the vehicle, the content has to be valuable and quality. But what about thinking about the fact that was presented earlier in the conference about medical knowledge doubling at an exponential rate, and the value of social media in allowing access as opposed to quality? Imagine if we had to, in the ED, and all these patients come in with a long list of drugs, you don't know the trade names, and you've got to write them down in generic names on your med chart. I mean, imagine if you had to go to the library and look up all of those drugs.
So I guess is what you're trying to say that we should have online databases that is different to, say, social networks in the first place in terms of trying to look for those drugs? Because I completely agree that we have the technology and we need to use the technology. But I think if we're down the content end of the spectrum where, say, MIMS or the AMH are creating that content for us to interact with and access, because we're still interacting, that's fundamentally important, and that's what we need to get right. Because if we don't get that right, then if we share that information across over in the other end of the spectrum where your Twitters and your Facebook is, I think that's where you lose out in terms of delivering quality or delivering garbage, because what you're delivering is still social media, it's just social media of a different type.
Thanks so much, everyone, for your questions. And can you please join me in thanking Viet for a terrific presentation?